very enthusiastic about starting this military career. I was one of those people that was an American firster. I did not know all of what was going on in Germany, or I might have had a different opinion about it. But I didn't think we had any business messing with European problems. So this is my own personal background as I went into the Army as a draftee June 25th of 1941. Now you'll find that I won't remember some general's name or some things like that, but I'm very good about the date when I went into the Army still. Incidentally, there's no prepared speech, so if any of you have questions, I want to talk about what you want to hear. I did go into the Army June 25th, 1941, and the Army was a mess. We had a few leftover World War I officers who I think generally knew what they were doing. Then we had some reserve officers, and they didn't know anything. I can remember early on being marched about 5 miles and winding up about a mile from camp. And I don't think we learned very much. We sang nice songs that night as we sat around the fires we built. But the Army was a real mess then. I went through basic training and then went on the Carolina maneuvers. And the Army was still a mess. The Quartermaster Corps must have been leftover World War I types. The main meal most every day was ham and cabbage, boiled cabbage. It got a little sickening after a while. Would have liked to have seen a hot dog even. But it was I think very necessary for what came later. The Carolina maneuvers were a learning experience, and things began to change as they went along. They took about 3 months. After I got through basic training, I wound up on the Carolina maneuvers. I had a good staff sergeant in charge of our section, and he liked me because I was a country boy, and if he sent me out to find some wood, I could find some wood that would burn for him. His name was Wessinger, and Wes and I got on very well together. We did have some calamity strike. We had a second lieutenant put in charge of us who came from Texas A&M. And the only thing I can remember that he knew was he knew he liked girls. He was always looking for a date. But the morning after he arrived, we got up and we said, "Oh, John, we've got trouble." His pup tent looked like a sway-backed horse. Of course it wasn't, but it was the sloppiest pup tent you ever saw in your life. And I said, "Will you help me? We got to keep him out of trouble as long as he's in charge of our section." So I said I would. But the Army was in pretty sad shape in the summer of '41. We did improve. We started having road markers out when we were moving instead of just going and getting lost and sitting beside the road for 2.5 hours while somebody found out where we were. I mention this to you because I don't think the average person realizes how long it takes to get an Army in condition to do something. Subsequently, I served under a very good West Pointer. He died young, but he died as Major General. So he went up fast. He was, I think, 37 or 38 out of West Point. And he was in the outfit because he thought there was a future for airborne troops and wanted being on the ground floor. But I asked him, when we got to know each other well, I said, suppose that you were put in charge of an outfit. You could have any officer or any enlisted man at your choice. After you got them all together, how long would it take you before you were ready to fight? He looked at me and he said, well, they're highly idealized conditions, but it would probably take me 6 months before I'd have them ready to go into combat. We'd all have to get to know each other, and that takes time. I mention this because I don't think we could put very many defensive troops in the field right now. Some of you will have to be drafted. You'll have to learn certain skills. You'll have to get to know who means what he says, who is very sure of himself, but you have to discount everything he says, and all those little personal interrelationships before you're going to be ready to go into combat, where somebody's life depends on somebody else doing it. Some men, you know, always minimize everything. Everything's wonderful, and others always think that the greatest calamity has befallen them. How on earth were they so unfortunate as to get in this outfit? So it goes. That's by way of background. You're all of draft age, and it can happen. And you're going to have to learn fast when it happens, because there won't be time this time. There was last time. There was time to get to know each other, get trained. But it does take time. Now to get on to what I was asked to talk about, I went to OCS. I figured we were in the war. We weren't yet, but it looked to me like we were going to be very shortly, and I was dead right on that. I applied for officer candidate school the day before Pearl Harbor. It shows that I do have some brains sometimes. So went through OCS, and I made a terrible mistake. We could sign up for different outfits, and one of them was the 602nd Field Artillery. Well, I knew the 620th had been a tank destroyer outfit, and I didn't think that would be too bad. And I reported into the 602nd, and the West Pointer, who was the executive officer, told us a terrible mistake had been made. Both OCS and Battery Officers Course had completely filled the cadre, and they had twice as many officers as they needed. So he started asking me some questions, and he found out I'd worked a little on a farm. I had driven horses on a hay loader, done a few things like that. And he said, "You know this is a mule pack outfit." I said, "No, sir, I don't." And he said, "Well, how do you feel about it?" And I said, "Well, I don't have any idea what a mule pack outfit is like. I have no feeling one way or the other." He said, "All right, we'll let you know." And sure enough, I made the mule pack outfit, and a bunch of the city boys that wanted to ride horseback didn't. That should have been a warning. I got out of the mule pack outfit. Well, we got 100% of our animal strength within 2 weeks of the time we got together. We had 29% of our men, and those mules had to be trained. We had to take them on a 2-hour march every day. We had to learn about packing them and so on. And I was getting pretty sick of mule pack. And some mules are ornery. Now, some mules are very fine animals. Don't discriminate because it's a mule. I had one beautiful mule, smoothest ride I ever had from any animal, horse or mule. But also there was an old K528. I traded him off to poor service battery. And one of the terms of the trade was that delivery was to be made at my stable. The sergeant showed up with a couple of men, and I said, "Don't you think you ought to have a little more help?" "Oh, no, sir, I can handle any mule that ever lived." Well, if he was that confident, I didn't push the issue any. And we got a halter on the mule, started him up the door and down the road. The sergeant's 2 men got as far as the middle of the road, and the mule took off. One man went one direction, one went the other. The sergeant chased him mightily, got hold of him, but didn't last very long. And that mule wound up in the flower gardens of the Broadmoor Hotel a week later. And I had great trouble with the service company officers for the rest of my time in the outfit. They didn't think I was to be trusted for some reason. I didn't do anything, it was that mule. Well, as I said, I got sick of the mules and I volunteered for airborne training. And I was in the test battalion for the airborne artillery. From there I wound up in the artillery battalion of the jumping battalion of the 11th Airborne Division. Ultimately, we wound up in New Guinea. Now, I got a battle star for New Guinea, and I want to tell you that that didn't amount to anything. We were Army Reserve for the Hollandia operation. And we got as close to having planes land on the airstrip near our base before they decided they didn't need us. However, I mention it because that, having been in Army Reserve there, got me 5 points towards discharge later on. Don't complain about something that looks like a waste of time. It might be manna from heaven later on. We went through unit training. And the airborne divisions had 2 gliders, artillery battalions, and 1 parachute one. The parachute one had 12 guns, and the others only had 6 guns. And we had substantially more men. Now that meant there were more people to get in trouble. Ultimately, we wound up on New Guinea, and then after the Hollandia operation, where the planes landed to load us up and then got told we weren't needed, we wound up on the shores of Leyte. I can't remember the exact date, but it was sometime, I think, in November of 1945. I hit Leyte. Our orders said that we were to prepare for an invasion of Luzon. We arrived at Leyte and we got told that we had to put troops in combat within 3 days of our landing. The Leyte campaign did not go as planned. The Japs made their major defense of the Philippines on Leyte. We had not anticipated that. So although we were scheduled for Luzon, we were immediately ordered in the Lady, and we wound up at a little hamlet called Burowan, where there was an airstrip. And we started the 511th, which was our parachute infantry regiment, up over the mountains to go to the west coast of Lady. We relieved the 7th, we relieved the 7th Division. They were pulled around and sent up the east side of the island of Lady. The 77th had been amphibiously landed at Ormoc. The 96th was to our right, and we were sent over the mountains to meet the 7th coming up the east coast, or the west coast of Lady. It was sort of a wild time, and the 511th rapidly outran the artillery support they had. We were armed with 75 pack howitzers, which could be dropped from an airplane easily. The first troops in, the 511th, were supported by artillery from the 155 Marine gun outfit down in the lowlands. But they outran them. So we had to drop some of our 75 pack howitzers so that they could have some artillery support. And this morning I was fixing the plane to drop the artillery pieces. There are 6 belly loads and 3 door loads when you drop a 75 pack howitzer out of a C-47. And I was putting all the belly loads up and in place, getting ready to go. And somebody came down from division headquarters and said I was to report to General Swing immediately. And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I don't know." So fortunately, my battalion commander was there, and Nick and I always got on well. Nick said, I'll take over here, you go find out what it's about. And I went up, and I got told that I was to become the assistant division quartermaster. Now, I knew nothing about quartermaster. I'd been a supply officer in my artillery outfit, but that was about it. So I tried to get out of it. I went to see my old battalion commander, who was a division training officer at the time, and he could do nothing for me, so I went to see General Farrell, who was the division artillery commander. And General Farrell was very nice to me, but he was very sorry, but he could do nothing to get me out of being the assistant division artillery officer. We had one unusual thing happen. I think it was a day after I found out the disaster had struck. The Japanese pulled an airborne attack on us. And that was a little exciting. I found out why most of the men were in the quartermaster company. I saw them dropping, and they were only a couple hundred yards away. And I thought we ought to get over there, because after a jump, you're always disorganized. Parachutes don't always come down where you expect them. The ammunition may not be with the guns, all sorts of things like that. I wanted to get right over there. But I guess that the people at division headquarters knew what the quartermaster company was. They didn't want me taking them over there. So we set up a good perimeter for the night and let the people that had been on the airstrip where the jump occurred come wandering in. I think I can still remember the password for that night, but only that night of all the days I was in service. It was an interesting night. I mostly saw to it that the division was fed. Now, the major accomplishment was we got turkey to them for Thanksgiving. Now, some of them were a day late, but they all got turkey for Thanksgiving. And you'd be surprised how much work it was to see that they got turkey for Thanksgiving. Not Thanksgiving, it was Christmas. It was Christmas. I got them a Christmas turkey. I didn't really do much on Lady, except see that the rations were drawn. Complained little about the fighting attitude of those people in quartermaster. Most of them were New York City boys, and I don't think they really got in the Army to fight. They didn't seem to have the right attitude. From Lady, when we got through to the West Coast, we got pulled back, and we went down to the beach on Lady to stage for going into Luzon. Now, the main thrust of the Luzon campaign came in at Lingayen. We were a diversionary attack. We went about probably 65 or 70 miles south of Manila. There was a little village called Nasugbu on the bay, and the division landed at Nasugbu. Now, we were under the Navy control when we went in there, and we didn't know what was going to happen until 11 o'clock that morning when the Navy Admiral decided it was safe to turn us loose. We got turned loose, and there was a road from Nasugbu to Tagaytay Ridge, approximately 30 miles, 35 miles. And the Japs had some strong defensive positions about 2 miles from the ridge. Now, our plan was that the amphibious forces would fight up the road to the ridge, and the parachute combat team, the 511th Regimental Combat Team, which was the, well, about 6,000 or 5,000, pardon, they had 3,000 of infantry and about 550 of artillery attached to them. They would jump on, make a parachute jump on the ridge itself. When the 188th, fighting up the road, thought that they could reach the ridge. And the operation went off as planned. I was not part of that. I got ashore, and I was seasick. Now, you shouldn't be seasick after you got off the boat, so I saw one of the doctors, and he checked a few things, and he said, "You aren't seasick, you've got yellow jaundice." And I said, "Oh, what does that mean?" He says, "That means I'm putting you in the hospital." So I went in the hospital. And I was quite sick for a couple of days. There were some very nice Filipino women that came in, and they had some homegrown sweet corn. And that was the first thing that I could keep down in a couple of days. Boy, I remember how good that sweet corn was. And I got that down, and I think it was that afternoon the division surgeon-in-chief came to examine me. The general wanted to know how soon I'd be able to go to work. And I told him that I kept the corn down, and he said, "Go, good." And he said, "You can sleep from dark till daylight. About 12 hours sleep a night ought to put you back in shape for a while." And I said, "All right, fine. We'll do that." So he said, "I'll clear you for duty as long as you've kept the meal down." And so I got in a Jeep and headed up to the ridge and found out that division headquarters had moved on to Paranaki, a little settlement on the outskirts of Manila itself. And I arrived there in due time. Didn't take long. Very interesting, the Jap tactics. They made certain lines of defense and they didn't care about anything else. And their line of defense was on the southern approaches to Manila. They expected our invasion was to come in from Batangas, which was about 80 miles to the south. And MacArthur came in instead about 60 miles to the north. And they were not prepared for him, and they had their defensive positions all set up to the south of Manila. And of course, we were to the south of Manila, and we came in from the south and hit their so-called Ginkgo line that they had set up for south of Manila. An airborne division is a kind of a mongrel puppy. A real division has about 14,000 men. The most we ever had was 8,600. Now, we had probably had 1,000 battle casualties on Lady, and we probably had another 2,000 guys down with yellow jaundice. I suspect if they'd run a blood test, every man in the division would have had yellow jaundice. They didn't do that. Some of them were only sick for 3 hours. Some of them were sick for 3 months. But we were woefully short of men. General Swing was West Pointer, but I think he was a little unusual. He'd cut his teeth in World War I, and he believed in always attacking. So while we were badly outnumbered, he went right after them. And he was successful in doing it. I suspect that most of his colleagues would have said he was absolutely crazy. If our intelligence reports are correct, we were outnumbered. I think the intelligence reports were probably correct, but I'm not sure of it. The official history doesn't indicate that we killed all that many Japanese, but the Japanese were in caves and pillboxes, and the method of attack was to sneak somebody up with some dynamite and blow the blooming thing up. Now, you didn't go in afterwards and count. You just knew that there had been some people in there. And I talked with a general who had been RG2 at that time, and I asked him which figure was right on the Jap casualties. And he said, "I think the higher one. We never counted." And a great many of them died in those pillbox explosions. So, but that's just a personal thing. If you look at the official history, there's a lower number. Anyway, we were successful. From taking Manila, we got sent south. There was a mountain. There was a mountain down there that the Japs had fortified. We had to take that. And that was a little sticky because we weren't getting it done quite as fast as the brass up north thought we should. Now they weren't getting shot at and we were. That makes some difference in how fast you think a job can get done. But ultimately we got them. Then we got pulled off to the east. There was another mountain down there that the Japs had fortified heavily. We went after them. We did have the 1st Cavalry Division helping us. They had the north sector and we had the south sector. And they were a great help. And that went on for most of the month of April. Now, I had been quartermaster, and the Army commander came down, and he caught my old outfit at a bad time. Both the battalion commander and the battalion G3, which is or S3, the operations officer, were up north watching them use proximity fuse, artillery shells with proximity fuse. You set them and they'd go off so many feet above the ground. Now, for those of you that haven't been in the artillery, an air burst is much more deadly than a ground burst. The explosive force of a ground burst is mostly in the ground. The air burst sends little fragments of shell all over everything. And they were up watching that. Well, we caught an ordnance officer as the battalion exec, and he didn't really know much. And he couldn't tell the Corps commander, I think it was the Corps commander, I don't think it was the Army commander, it may have been the Army commander, but he couldn't tell him what his fields of fire were. And everybody got jumped on. And I got summoned to the division commander's office. As I came in, the division artillery commander, General Farrell, was talking with General Swing, and I heard this. General, you've robbed that battalion of its officers for your staff. Said, give me John back. And General Swing said, well, John, you've got a promotion in. How do you feel about it? I said, I want to go back to the artillery. And I did. They were a good bunch. They were a bunch of fighters. I didn't want to be with a bunch of people that weren't going to want to get some Japs when they were right there for the getting. So I went back to the artillery, and that didn't last long. About the 1st of May, they had a new program where people that had a certain number of children and been overseas for a certain time would be sent back to the States. And the Division G4 had all the children that you could get any points for, and he'd been in a long time, and he was going back, and General Swing summoned me to his office and said, Stout's going back to the States on this rotation of officers. How would you feel about being the G4? I said, fine. Now I thought I wasn't with those quartermaster guys that did not want to fight. I'd be with the division staff, and I had great confidence in the G3 and great confidence in the old man. Now, I might not have had much confidence in the assistant division commander. I guess he was all right, but he wasn't in it with the other two. So I went back to the division as G4. I got in for the Aperi operation, which was to see that the northern end of Luzon was clear of Japanese forces. They were. I think we put a regimental combat team in up there, and I think they killed one Jap. I think they got one of them. I didn't see any others. So that was my combat experience as the part of the division staff. I had to go up there and get them out. And the G3 and I figured it'd be fun if I jumped and could tell the boys that had jumped in up there that I had a combat jump too. But unfortunately, the old man had a mole in the parachute maintenance company. Now, you wouldn't think that. Some rascal, my friend, the G3, had drawn a parachute for me, and I was just getting ready to get on the plane and go up and jump. And we got summoned to the division commander's office. And the conversation went something like this: "You two, there'll be no sophomoric tricks like John jumping from a plane up there." Yes, sir. That's as close as I got to a combat jump. I had the parachute drawn, but the general put the kibosh on. I would guess that he did not want me spraining an ankle or a knee because he knew what was ahead of us. The next month was one of my most miserable months of working. Nothing to do with the combat, but we had to get the invasion plans for Operation Olympic, where we were to take the southern half of the island of Kyushu. There were to be 3 corps that were to go in ahead of us. We were to get the first turnaround shipping, and we were to support whoever needed help most. Now, I have a somewhat different attitude towards the atomic bomb than many people do. I can probably find at least half of you that don't think we should have dropped the atomic bomb. But let me tell you, I'm very grateful that Truman dropped the atomic bomb. Now, since I'm a hard-ribbed upstate Republican, I wasn't so enthusiastic about Truman, but that decision to drop the atomic bomb was a dandy. And I'm very, very grateful that he did. Month of August, I was working on 2 things. Loading plans for, we got the first turnaround shipping from the invasion of Kyushu. I had to have loading plans for them, and I didn't know what ships the Japs were going to sink and which ones we'd get. I knew that I could put certain things on certain types of ship. Also, following Kyushu, after we got the southern half of Kyushu, we were going to attack the homeland of Japan. We were to attack the northern edge of Tokyo Bay. And our division was to be the lead division in an airborne drop to seize that. I think it was the 17th they were bringing from Europe to back us up. They'd take our planes and make another jump with them. And I was working on that wildly. And in the middle of all this, I would put the date at about the 20th of July. A major from the Air Force came in and wanted to know how many planes would be needed to fly the division from a departure drone 800 miles away from the objective zone. Well, I excused myself and on the way to the bathroom stopped in the map room and took a look, and it was just 800 miles from Okinawa to the airport near Yokohama, the big airport there. So the Air Force officer and I worked mightily on that, and we had a real problem because the airplanes we had didn't have enough capacity to get up to Kyushu, or up to the Tokyo-Yokohama area and back. They could get up all right. Then we'd have to fly in gasoline to get them back. And we worked mightily on it, and we had something that we thought might go. Then we had to fly the division up to Okinawa to get ready to depart. And I still had these plans to load the division and units on DC-3s or 4s. And all of a sudden, from all over the world, they started bringing in DC-6s. This was a bigger transport plane, and it had enough gas capacity to get from Okinawa to Tokyo and back to Okinawa. So they didn't have to fly in a whole lot of planes just to gas them up. And that was the most interesting operation. We took off as planned. We were very worried that some Japanese father that had lost 6 sons in the service would see how many of the American devils he could take out. We landed and there were no incidents. The surrender went smoothly. MacArthur flew in at 2 that afternoon. We couldn't have protected him from a frying pan attack, I don't think. We had 3,000 men, had a few mortars, but we didn't have a piece of artillery in when he came in. I know some people called him Dugout Doug, but that man had great courage because he knew we couldn't have defended him from an attack. He also knew that there were 15,000 Japanese under arms around that airport where we landed. But it went without any trouble at all. Now I had an interpreter. Had a little 17-year-old boy, Japanese boy, and he was very bright and alert, spoke English well. I asked him his background, and he had been brought up in Hawaii, and he lived there until he was 12 years old when his grandparents saw the war coming and hauled him from Hawaii to Japan. And of course, since he was fluent in English, the Japanese had him as an interpreter. And I had him, and he was good. And after I'd been there a week and we'd had no incidents, nobody had been shot at, and everything's been fine, I said to him, we were amazed that there'd been no incidents. He said, we see the soldiers and sailors and Marines at every place that a road intersects, standing guard. They all come to attention and they turn their back on us. They apparently can't stand us. Oh, you misunderstand. They are showing you the same respect they would show the emperor. It would not be for their lowly eyes to gaze upon him. And that is why they are turning their back on you. Did you know the Emperor asked us to all cooperate with you? And that is why there have been no incidents. You can imagine how I felt when I picked up the overseas edition of Time about 2 weeks later, and Time was urging us to try the Emperor as a war criminal. I've rambled on. Have I done what you wanted me to?
Oh, yes.
Questions? Any number. Must be somebody's got another class.
No, it's just sometimes we have to get the pump primed here a little bit. Charles, you're sitting over there.
Well, the Mule teams, weren't they used in the Philippines?
No, they were used on the Burma Road. My brother-in-law wound up in Burma, and he ate some of my mules.
I can tell you who else was in Burma with that mule artillery was our former Assemblyman Steve Hawley.
Did Steve wind up in the mule artillery?
Oh, yes, he was in the mule artillery.
I didn't know
He came in
that.
and talked last
know.
fall to us.
I didn't. Steve and I paths crossed once or twice, but I didn't know that he wound up in.
Well,
I'll have to talk to him. Maybe he knew old K528. That was a miserable mule. I shouldn't have wished that on Steve. No.
He was caught in the same situation, being a farm boy. You know.
Yeah.
Well, obviously you know how to deal with farm animals, and Steve had played polo.
Yes, he was a good polo player
At Cornell. And they thought, well, if you know something about horses, you know something about mules, and put him in the mule artillery.
So it goes. Be careful what you admit to.
Anybody, come on.
Any questions?
Go ahead.
Do you think that like any of the original like disorganization you were talking about when you first went in the service?
What?
When you were talking about how everything was kind of disorganized when you first went in the service?
Yes.
Do you think that like contributed to any like loss of lives?
Well, fortunately, we didn't get in the war until 6 months later. And they got rid of a lot of those World War II people that were commanding things when I came in. World War I people, yeah. You remember, Eisenhower, about the time I came in, was just getting promoted from lieutenant colonel to colonel. And Patton was one of the few high-ranking officers that stayed in and fought.
So if you hadn't had that 6 months to get ready, then it would have been a mess.
It would have been a real mess. Now, I don't know how the Navy was. I'm ever grateful to those thieving swabbies for the job they did at Midway, Norm. Now, they stole my jump boots right out of a locker on their ship, but they did catch the Jap Navy. Any other questions?
Your ROTC officers, what can you comment about those people?
Some were good, some were bad, as you'd expect them to be. That guy that came to us when we were on the Carolina maneuvers, he was about as bad as I've ever seen. But there were some good ROTC guys.
How would you rate the West Pointers?
Either terrible or very good. They were either outstanding. I can't remember a mediocre West Pointer.
Okay.
Okay? They were either good or no good. And there were some of both. Do I surprise you?
No. I spent quite a bit of time, well, about a month at West Point with their training program for ROTC,
Yes.
people teaching military history.
Mm-hmm.
And we run into a number of instructors that weren't any good in the classroom, and we figured if they weren't any good there, they probably weren't going to be any good out in the battlefield either.
Probably not. You have to think a little faster on the battlefield.
Oh, yes. So you went from what, second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, you left as a major?
Left as a major, yes. I had had a light colonel's job for about 6 months, but as soon as Europe ended, the Army ended promotions. Didn't start them again until the next January when they needed to. So I zigged when I should have zagged.
Earl?
So you were part of the occupational force in Japan?
Yes.
How long did that last?
Well, for me, it only lasted from August 31st to, let's see, I shipped out about November 25th.
Oh, 1 minute. Was it MacArthur who wanted to keep Japan as a protectorate, like an industrial state? We send our supplies over there.
No, they had Japan was a mess. They had a lot of soldiers, and were still bringing more from China. A large part of the Japanese army was in China at the time of the surrender. And so MacArthur had a pretty shaky situation there, and he did a noble job of keeping the emperor in power. I told you what the kid told me. And this was somebody that was Americanized. Spent his first 12 years in this country. And yet he felt that way.
Did you have any of the Nisei, Japanese Americans, with you as you went across the Pacific?
Yes, we had some with us, and we had to protect them carefully. They were a problem. We had a special squad who protected the Nisei. We needed them to read the Japanese documents. The Japanese were very funny in some ways. You know, we'd give you our name, rank, and serial number, period. Nothing more. They'd tell you everything that we wanted to know. We get all kinds of information from them, but we needed the Nisei to read the documents that we captured. And they were good boys. But some fool from the 511th would have thought he found a Jap and would have shot him if we hadn't protected him carefully.
How old were you when you were doing this? When you hit Japan, how old were you?
When I was in Japan, I was 28 then, or I turned 28 that October.
Well, that's why the guys you were commanding called you the old man.
Yes. Yes, I was an old man. See, I was out of law. I was admitted to practice law when I went in. I was 22.
Where'd you do your undergraduate law degrees?
I did them at Cornell.
Cornell.
Yeah. But see, I was, and most of them were 17.
The reason I asked is I know we've talked about this before, but I can't quite imagine being 28 and when you're on application course in another country. At age 28, I remember what I was doing when I was 28.
Well, I behaved much better than you do, Norm. My mother will tell you so. Any other questions?
Anyone, come on. Garth?
You mentioned the importance of maintaining the emperor in charge of Japan at the end of the war. Do you think that demilitarization of the Japanese military would have been much more difficult had the emperor not remained in power?
I would say impossible. They had been brought up to respect the emperor and to do what he wanted. And MacArthur was a complex personality, but he understood the Japanese.
Anybody else?
You've got a question over here, I think.
Marine Corps, I don't want to smash any other branches of the service or this or that. But some of the history books, if you read them, they say they caused a lot more deaths than what they're giving credit for us.
Well, of course, I'm an Army man.
Also-
Now, when my brother comes, and I understand you've got him coming, he'll defend the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
I thought,
I was told very early on not to bring the two of them together. I talked to his brother Friday night. He came to see HMS Pinafore. I was talking to Barbara, and he said, can't put John and I in the same room. He says, I'm firmly convinced that one Rotarian can whip 3 Kiwanians, and he's firmly convinced one Kiwanian can whip 3 Rotarians. He says, we'll never get anything accomplished.
and I'm perfectly satisfied that one paratrooper can take care of 5 Marines, and he feels the opposite.
What about the Marines, John?
Well, I didn't like their tactics. The Marines, at least as they were during the war, believed in frontal assaults. And where was it? We got all excited. Was it either in Korea or Vietnam? The Marines actually had an encirclement. Can you imagine that? That was my old friend, the Division G3, that pointed out that they had performed. Frontal assaults are pretty brutal. That was why World War I was so disastrous.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm?
Yes.
Anything else? Well, thank you for listening
Well,
to an
thank
old
you.
man ramble.
Thank you very much for that.
Certainly welcome.
What we're going to do
If you want to sit for just a minute, I'll go up and